Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the afternoon program. In this second session, we explored how major powers are shaping the strategic environment in the South China Sea. We are deeply honored to have Her Excellency Ambassador Pham La Dung, former acting President of Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and President of Asian Society of International Law as moderator. Dr. Dung, the floor is yours.
May I kindly invite all the panelists to come up to the stage, please. Distinguished panelists, dear participants, it's my great honor to moderate this session of the conference, and I would like to express our sincere thanks to all the panelists from traveling from different parts of the world to join this event today here. And we all know that this session will examine the complex and evolving involvement of great powers in the South China Sea that will probably looking beyond what's happening in the South China Sea, and hopefully will shed some light on the substance, on what is underneath. My great honor to introduce the panelists of our session today, Professor Shao Minghao, Deputy Director of the Center for American Studies, Fudan University, China. Thank you. Ms. Henrietta Levin, Senior Fellow, Freeman Chair in China Studies, United States. Thank you. Professor Lexutina Yana, Deputy Head, Institute of China, Contemporary Asia, Russian Academy of Sciences, Russia. Dr. Michał Bogus, OSW Center for Eastern Studies, Poland. Our friend Dr. Tan Seong Moon, Senior Fellow, Joseph Ishan Institute, Singapore. So I would like to kindly remind everyone that each speaker will have from 7 to 10 minutes, and we will save around half an hour for Q&A session. And just on behalf of all of you, I know that the speaker here will present their own perspective and not representing any organization, neither the organizers of this conference. And with that in mind, my honor to introduce Professor Minghao. Yes, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I want to appreciate the candid invitation by the Academy, and I want to thank the hard work of the Academy to make this conference possible and successful. Well, I have 3 points to share. The first one, in order to understand the changing landscape of the South China Sea issue, we have to put US-China long-term power play into our consideration. Both Beijing and Washington want to avoid the armed conflicts, but the new Cold War, the worst case scenario thinking, the related military activities, and the mutual escalation of gray zone tactics in this region may deepen the security dilemma and drag us into an unintended war. I'm sorry, because of the US-China tension, it made a lot of friends, especially this region feel very concerned. In August, I attended US-China-Singapore bilateral dialogues in Singapore, and we Chinese and American participants got a very hard question from Singapore's defense minister, Mr. Chen. And he asked, are your Chinese and Americans ready for a new EP3 incident? We know in 2001, we had an EP3 incident. So that's a very hard question. We need compare notes on the implications of the Trump 2.0 and its implications on the international order. As a transformative leader, Trump 2.0 makes the mainstreaming of right-wing populism and the rise of illiberal democracy in the United States, which could be very consequential to the trajectory of international order. Someone even said that Trump seems to embrace the mighty makes right international order rather than the so-called liberal international order. Last week, Xi Jinping, Chinese president, held our summit with President Trump in South Korea, which sent a positive signal for China-US relations. Prior to the meeting, Trump posted on social media, he said, the G2 will be convening shortly. The G2 narrative is very, very interesting. Well, I think we have no reason to exaggerate the mentioning of G2 by President Trump, but it is important to recognize that President Trump does attach importance on increasing major power coordination between Beijing and Washington. While Chinese analysts, they have doubts over the sustainability of Trump's restraint on the Taiwan question and the South China Sea issue. It's very challenging for China and the United States to revitalize mutual trust. During our talk in Singapore, I still remember one term given by our American counterparts. We think about amicable divorce between our two countries. We need to find a good divorce lawyer in Singapore and other countries. However, I think in terms of the South China Sea issue, I want to emphasize there is a dangerous but important nexus between South China Sea issue and the Taiwan question. From a Chinese perspective, the key challenge is how to deal with the increasing linkage between different security hotspots in this region, even including the Korean Peninsula, security challenge. In particular, the US, the Philippines, among other actors, are making efforts to link the China Sea issue with the Taiwan question. And some senior officials in the Trump administration, such as Elbridge Colby, proposed the strategy of denial, aiming to deter China. In particular, American military presence in the Philippines is a big concern for Beijing. And this military presence has been expanding continuously, largely aiming to address the potential Taiwan contingency. For example, Northern Luzon is located just 155 miles south of Taiwan, where the US ground forces such as the 25th Infantry Division frequently conducted more complex drills there. The Trump administration is also enhancing its capacities for conducting long-range precision strikes with weapons such as the Tomahawk cruise missiles, and US Secretary of War Peter Hegseth even announced the deployment of Marine Corps anti-ship missiles launchers in the places such as northern Philippines. And also the US is introducing the TIFO, mid-range missile system, in the Philippines and Japan. So Beijing keeps a very close eye on those military moves. The last part I want to share with you China's approaches in maintaining stability. China is searching for a new strategy for navigating international order transformation, addressing US-China rivalry, and maintaining regional peace in an age of turbulence. First, China wants to make diplomacy alive for stabilizing the South China Sea issue. We Chinese and friends in Asian countries, we need to think about how to conclude the consultation negotiations on the COC and realize the goal of, for an early conclusion of COC in next year. Second, economic cooperation is still critical for addressing security challenges. And I think in China, among many countries, they have to face the very key challenge, that is how to address the development security nexus issue. Maritime economic collaboration, joint projects on disaster relief, and resilient infrastructure can play a positive role. Climate change is a real threat, especially for the participants in this room from the Pacific Island countries. And it has profound implications on the security landscape in the region. Last but not least, US and China are expected to enhance security consultations, reach some degree of new modus vivendi on Taiwan, on South China Sea issue, and enrich the crisis prevention, crisis management mechanisms. In recent days, US Secretary of War Peter Hegseth held a meeting with China's Minister of Defense Dong Jun in Malaysia, and the two sides agreed to strengthen military-to-military channels to de-conflict and de-escalate any problems that arise. And also in China, actually last month, we held the China-US security dialogue involving former Commander-in-Chief of US Pacific Command, Admiral Dennis Blair, former Commander of US Marine Corps, General David Berger, and other American participants. I could not provide you details of this dialogue, but I can sense a willingness from both sides to seriously defend the military-to-military dialogues and coordination. Given the increasing military activities of both American and Chinese militaries, there is a significant risk that some incidents may happen, which can lead to serious escalation. While some small steps may be useful, such as developing procedures for both militaries to collaborate in rescuing mariners and air crews lost at sea. So some small steps we need to think about. And also I want to bring your attention to the recent report released by the RAND Corporation, the author Michael Mazar. And I think this report is very important. And it proposes some tactical procedures for enhancing military communication and preventing unintended conflicts. So I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ming Hao, for your insightful presentation. And as the moderator, may I take the liberty to ask a question in advance for the Q&A session that will follow afterward. So you mentioned about the China approach in maintaining stability in the South China Sea, which is very impressive and comprehensive, ranging from economic to maritime cooperation and security, including building mechanism, trust building, and military-to-military channels. So what challenges this approach might be facing in being implemented effectively, both from the US side and from the China side itself? And what is the red line that point China may reconsider its approach? And this is not for now. Okay? Yeah. So the next speaker is Lily.
Great. Well, thank you to DAV for organizing such an exceptional set of conversations. Very honored to participate. So as the Washington-based representative on this panel, I think it's my job to try and explain the US approach to the South China Sea. And so over the course of 2025, the United States goals, posture, exercises, and deployments, as the guiding question raises, I think have actually remained remarkably consistent in a year when many previously sacrosanct policies and institutions have been reevaluated by President Trump and his lieutenants. The United States has remained remarkably committed in the South China Sea to upholding freedom of navigation and overflight, contesting China's sweeping maritime claims, and supporting allies and partners. And so you've seen the United States continue to pursue a robust program of increasingly multilateralized military exercises to uphold these goals and principles in the South China Sea. You've seen a continued drumbeat of freedom of navigation operations in which the United States contests unlawful claims near certain features in the South China Sea. You've seen a real continued focus on capacity building support for Southeast Asian partners, with a real emphasis on the asymmetric capabilities that these countries really need to be able to uphold their sovereign rights within the South China Sea. And the United States has continued to support ASEAN's efforts to negotiate a code of conduct. And of course we have Secretary Hegseth in Vietnam right now, and I expect he will affirm many of these principles again during his time here. But there have been some small changes in the US position that may have outsized significance. One that has stood out to me is that the United States no longer affirms the relevance of UNCLOS by name in the South China Sea, though it does still raise the importance of the 2016 arbitral tribunal and still calls on all parties to conform to international law in the South China Sea, but it's no longer specified which body of international law that is, which I think does matter to some degree, if only because it creates a point of separation between the United States and its most like-minded partners on this issue. And even, for example, I'm looking forward tomorrow to session 5 of this conference on UNCLOS as an anchor of maritime stability. And again, I think it'll just be a little more difficult for the US if it diverges from the language of the region on this issue. Another change that stood out to me is that President Trump does not seem to have raised South China Sea issues in his engagements with President Xi over the course of this year, whereas in the past, for example, in President Biden's meetings with Xi, this was always quite a top priority in what was admittedly a difficult but an important agenda. And so even while Trump's cabinet secretaries have been very vocal in affirming the importance the United States places on the South China Sea, the fact that they haven't received attention at that very highest level may signal to China, perhaps inaccurately, that the strength of US resolve on the issue is waning. And then, of course, I think it's worth acknowledging that in other theaters, US respect for freedom of navigation and international maritime law has eroded rather precipitously. And as much as support for these principles in the South China Sea appears unchanged, the divergence, I think, does complicate the US position to some degree. I won't spend too much time characterizing China's goals and policies in the South China Sea because I don't know if I could do a better job than Ray and Jay did at the prior panel. But I will just maybe offer one comment on the broader political context in Beijing. And I think over the course of this year, we've seen the Chinese government really place a renewed focus on its regional ambitions and regional strategy. And one thing that really stood out to me was the Central Work Conference on Work Related to Periphery that Xi Jinping addressed in April of this year, which I think did signal a much more significant policy emphasis on China's regional strategy, including in its maritime periphery. So we should assume that South China Sea considerations really are on top of mind for the highest level decision makers in the Chinese government. And thinking about the conversation this morning, one piece from the public readout of that Central Work Conference that stood out to me was Xi Jinping saying that China's relations with neighboring countries are the best they have ever been, which is a good reminder that China is still sensitive to its international reputation, including in the South China Sea when it comes to regional affairs. Following up on the transparency exchange from earlier, China never says that ramming Philippine ships is okay. It never says that harassing these ships is acceptable. It says that China isn't doing that China's not responsible for those actions. And so I think that does emphasize that transparency and being clear regarding regional concerns on this issue can be impactful. I want to address the second guiding question for the panel: what triggers could spark a crisis? One issue that has always worried me is a scenario where Chinese actions in the South China Sea invoke U.S. alliance commitments. And I do not believe this is the intent of anyone. But I think that Chinese vessels have not always done the math right in their efforts to stay below a threshold that would draw the U.S. into a conflict. If we think back to the challenges around Second Thomas Shoal last year, even the level of violence that China was already bringing to bear against Philippine service members, I mean, if we were all just slightly less lucky, could have been a mass casualty event where the U.S.-Philippines alliance would have been triggered. And I think that the administration has been very clear, the current administration, that the U.S.-Philippines alliance does apply, and I'm just going to read this, to armed attacks on Philippine armed forces, public vessels or aircraft, including those of its Coast Guard, anywhere in the South China Sea. And I read that specifically because it's not even really a policy statement from Washington. That's seen as a legal obligation. And a sacred one for the United States to come through in that scenario to defend the Philippines. And so I think that even if it is no one's intent, we could see an escalation spiral as a result of these alliance commitments being triggered. And I think it's also worth kind of reflecting on how confident Beijing is right now in the context of the US-China relationship, where I think that the Chinese walked away from the summit with the United States and Korea feeling like they got everything that they needed while giving very little in return. And you also see a very significant Chinese confidence in the region. And so I don't begrudge China that confidence, but I think it does increase the risk that China could underestimate the resolve of other players, both in the region and from beyond it in the South China Sea, which further increases this risk of a crisis. And then, so that brings us to the third guiding question, which is, are existing communication mechanisms among big powers adequate? And I think the answer is clearly and unfortunately no. I think US-China military-to-military communication is incredibly important. It's something that we've never managed to quite get right. And so it's a good thing that Secretary Hegseth seems to have established further channels with PLA counterparts that he announced just recently. But there are real structural impediments to those channels being as useful as at least the United States would like to see, especially in a crisis. And I think there are three primary reasons for that, the first is that I think Beijing often prefers to express displeasure in a crisis by turning off communication channels rather than picking up the phone to express displeasure that way. I think we additionally, even if the channel is nominally open, at least in the military domain, the incentives for PLA officers to pick up the phone on a sensitive issue and talk to Americans without policy guidance, I mean, those incentives are not there. And I think many of our countries have had the experience of attempting to use kind of the nominal hotlines that we have with Beijing and not getting an answer on the other end. And then there's also a counterpart challenge where, for example, the US Secretary of Defense and the Chinese defense minister have very different roles and responsibilities. So even when they do get on the phone, it's not always the conversation that would be most powerful in facilitating the de-escalation that both sides need to see. But the stakes are so high that we have to keep trying, and it is encouraging to see potential progress even in the last few days to establish more robust channels between the two militaries, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Levin, for your insightful and thought-provoking remarks. I also have a question for you for the next session. What do you think, what method might the Trump administration be prepared to take in order to achieve its objectives, including defending its allies and upholding the freedom of navigation and international law? And you mentioned about the asymmetry with the counterparts. Does it really matter, and how the US can overcome and address that issue? Thank you. So our next speaker, Professor Yana, please.
Dear Excellencies, dear distinguished guests, dear colleagues, since roughly 2010, the involvement of non-regional major powers in the South China Sea has been rapidly increasing. That's what we can see, that's what we observe. And it was in 2010 when Washington, for the first time, highlighted the South China Sea at the Shangri-La Dialogue Forum. But since approximately 2016, more and more non-regional actors have become active in the South China Sea. Like, for example, France, the United Kingdom, Canada, Germany, the G7, the EU, Netherlands, Italy, just to name a few. And this involvement is reflected in multiple direct and indirect ways, like the issuance of statements expressing great concerns about the situation in the South China Sea and China's actions there, the conduct of freedom of navigation operations, military exercises and patrols in the South China Sea, providing military aid and selling sophisticated weaponry to claimant countries except for China, strengthening the defense cooperation with countries involved in territorial disputes in South China Sea, strengthening military alliances with regional states, creating new multilateral structures like, for example, AUKUS, the Quad, various trilaterals and other mini-multilateral structures. But why? Why do we have so many non-regional actors to be involved in the South China Sea? For sure, these actors are not claimants. They don't have any territorial claims here in the South China Sea. Those countries don't have vital interests here in South China Sea. They don't have even vital interests in the region. They're located geographically so distant from South China Sea. So why? Why do they care? Why they're getting more and more engaged here militarily? Some people would say probably that's because the center of the economy has shifted to the Asia Pacific. The political and economic balance is increasingly shifting towards the Asia Pacific. The largest trade partners of major non-regional actors are also located here in the Asia Pacific, and large volumes of trade transit South China Sea. But I would argue that that was the case even in the beginning of the 21st century. Nothing has changed in this respect. But the involvement of non-regional actors, I would probably trace, started from 2016, maybe 2015. So there should be other explanation to this tendency, to this trend. So I probably try to provide my explanation to this, to this trend, like more and more non-regional actors are here in the South China Sea. So the first one is that a trigger to this policy has been the rise in Chinese influence in the region and beyond. They expanded Chinese activities in the South China Sea to promote its territorial claims in disputed areas. In 2013, China started large-scale reclamation of islands, followed by militarization of the same islands, which was seen as very provocative and very alarming undertaking from the perspective of non-regional actors as well. The second reason of the increased activity of major countries in the South China Sea is the reassessment, rethinking, reconsidering of relations with China. China is now viewed by many Western countries very differently compared to the previous times. China viewed not as a partner, but rather as a competitor, a systemic rival, against which de-risking or containment policy must be implemented. Such a shift in many Western European capitals and in the EU as a whole started to evolve since 2015-2016. China's growing assertiveness, that's how Chinese actions in the South China Sea are called in the Indo-Pacific strategy of France, for example. Major powers' activities in the South China Sea are tightly connected to China, and the same logic is true for their increasing involvement in Taiwan issue, in East China Sea issue. Major powers, major countries perceive Chinese actions in these areas as a threat to the stability of the region. And third explanation is that major powers aim to counteract the dominance of one state in the Indo-Pacific. Right now it's China. And that's very interesting. Why? Because those countries, they're promoting and striving for multipolar regional order in the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, the very same countries are very okay, very comfortable with unipolar world order with American supremacy. The reason for that is that their belief that the shape of tomorrow's international order will be decided in the Indo-Pacific. And they're very uneasy to live with the idea that China would be a dominant power in the world. And finally, the fourth explanation is the US-China rivalry, like we just mentioned. Because it opens a window of opportunity for non-regional actors to engage more in the Asia-Pacific region. Because regional countries, for example, ASEAN countries, don't want to choose, between the United States and China, or fall into a unilateral dependency. Against the US-China rivalry, they want to diversify its partners. So non-regional actors can present themselves as offering regional countries an alternative to the United States and to China. And on top of that, the United States under Trump administration is seen as unreliable partner. So major powers have to take more responsibilities for protecting rules-based regional order, including the South China Sea. As a result of these growing concerns over rising Chinese influence and potential dominance in the region, regional major countries such as Australia, Japan, the US, India, and ASEAN, and some non-regional powers as well, has adopted their own Indo-Pacific concepts or documents. France, for example, in 2019, Germany and Netherlands in 2010, the EU in 2021, Canada in 2022. And a very interesting case I want to highlight, that's the case of France, because it calls itself an Indo-Pacific nation. France is the only EU country with overseas territories here in the Indo-Pacific, and 7 out of 13 French overseas territories are located exactly here in the Indo-Pacific. Moreover, France holds the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world, 90% of which is also here in the Indo-Pacific. France's Indo-Pacific strategy was published in 2019 and it was updated twice, the most recent just in this year. It emphasizes the need to work with regional partners to ensure the security of French territory and freedom of navigation. And since 2014, France has, on a regular basis, deployed warships to the region to ensure freedom of navigation in sensitive areas, including those in South China Sea and also in Taiwan Strait as well. France 2 or 3 times a year engages its ships in operations in the South China Sea, including exercises with partners and single patrols. And France is just one of the examples. There are multiple examples of other non-regional actors becoming more and more engaged here in the South China Sea, and I want to highlight militarily. Like I mentioned before, Germany, Great Britain, Netherlands, even Italy, Canada, the EU, G7 are very active here. So I don't want to kind of, criticize of what non-regional actors have been doing here in the South China Sea. I clearly understand the logic and probably the best aspirations of what they are doing here, like protecting the freedom of navigation, as a part of protecting international law, backing smaller countries vis-a-vis rising great power. But still, there are these two ideas right now on my mind. Like when non-regional actors expand the presence in the South China Sea, they usually say that they're very neutral, they're not taking sides in the territorial disputes. But is it so in reality? When you issue strong statements criticizing actions of one side, isn't it taking sides? Or when you literally weaponize other side by providing weaponry, even of defensive nature, isn't it taking sides? Or when you create unilateral structures aimed at containing a specific country, isn't it taking sides? And second, speaking about military activities of non-regional actors, these activities serve more a symbolic and public image, but have very limited positive impact on security challenges in the region. And the principal question here is to what extent rising military activities of non-regional actors serve the goal of easing the tensions in the South China Sea and limiting Chinese military activities. I would call it counterproductive. In 2015, for example, China didn't have military facilities in the Spratly Islands, but today we have military bases on several islands. And from this perspective, it is evident that China is not deterred by expanded military activities of non-regional actors. Instead, it promotes further militarization of Chinese claims. So, what is the solution? I'm sure that expanding military presence in the South China Sea would lead us to nowhere. We are already in the vicious circle of regional militarization. I believe that the major problem with non-regional actors to be involved here in the South China Sea is not the risk of miscalculations and unplanned collisions, but that their expanded military presence makes China feel a security dilemma and step up its military expansion in the region, which in turn make other regional countries to increase their military might. And in the end of the day, we have this booming regional militarization and unprecedented levels of military spending. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yang, for your speech. My question for you is, could you elaborate a little bit more about Russian perspective in South China Sea, and would you consider it as optimal from your point of view, or there is anything that would be improved? Thank you. Professor Dr. Boglas, please.
Thank you. Well, today I'm in the role of this person who is presenting the EU stand. So previously it was said that EU pretend not to take the sides. I agree. EU takes sides. EU always takes sides of the international law. And if someone wants to be on the other side, it's there because it's breaking the law, international law and order. If you don't want to be on the other side, just don't break the law. Follow the international law. It's very simple. And what's the interest of EU in peaceful resolving of the situation in the South China Sea? I have only one slide, promise. I will not make you to split the focus, but I will be back to the slide at the end. So I could put three main basic reasons why the EU is interested in the South China Sea or wider in the Pacific. First, it's maintaining the existing international legal order. Very simple. UNCLOS is the base of the international law of resolving the maritime disputes. And from the EU perspective, this is the most important part. resolving the disputes here, following the UNCLOS, it will reinforce international order based on the law. Simple. Very simple concept. There is the rules, which we all sign up, we all agree, and then we should all follow them. Nothing else, nothing more. And this is the reason why we always take sides. And if it seems that we're taking the other side, yes, because we take the side of the victim. Second, EU economic security. Let's not be afraid to talk about the economic security. EU have the same rights to the economic security like any other country. China is talking about its economic security. US is talking about its economic security, and we as the European Union have the rights to talk about our economic security as well. The South China Sea is one of the main maritime routes. We need to protect these routes. For us, yes, for us as the Europeans as well, and for the other global participants. And of course, the role of the coastal countries in the global chain values is very important for us. Any conflict here will negatively impact the European economy. So yes, we are here and we are interested in being here. Freedom of the navigation, yes. This is one of the most important values for us. And yes, European countries will participate, they are participating, and they will increase its participation in the execution of the freedom of the navigation in the region. According to the UNCLOS, majority of the features of the South China Sea is not generating territorial waters, and it's not generating economic exclusive zones. So there's no provocation passing by the open sea, even if some countries pretend to be their territorial waters. And then the third, probably the most important, national security. All the member states and the EU as a whole. It's difficult not to escape the conflict which is going on in Europe now. For very, very simple. There's a linkage. We see the linkage between conflict in Europe and this one could potentially be in the future in the East Asia and again in the Europe. Because growing cooperation, de facto alliance between China and Russia, creating a situation in which any conflict in this region, also South China Sea, around Taiwan, East China Sea, with Japan, will create opportunity by the pure opportunistic chance or by the coordination, I believe more likely by the coordination, for the Russia to create another conflict in Europe, probably around the Baltic states. So yes, for us, the security in the Pacific, in the South China Sea, is also part of the European security. Simply like that. Some people will not like it, but this is what it is. For very simple reasons, because it's logic that if China decides to take action or vis-a-vis Philippines, or Taiwan, or Japan, this will create the opportunity for the Russia, with coordination to split resources, attention of the Western powers between two teachers. And so yes, Europe is present and will be present, and this presence here will be increased. Especially come back to the reality in Europe and the need to increase our spending on the defense budgets will also create for us opportunity to be more present, proportionally, of course, to be in the region of the South China Sea or in the Pacific. Well, after being gloomy and doomy, let me be on some more positive note. UNCLOS works. As you have here, great example how UNCLOS works. almost 50 years of the dispute between Poland and Denmark for the demarcation of the economic exclusive zones south from the Bornholm island to the Baltic Sea. And even after '89, and the change of the democratization in Poland, when we both become like-minded nations, it took us almost another 20 years to negotiate demarcation. And only 2018, using the UNCLOS, not some created ad hoc institution in Hong Kong or another place, but using the old school negotiations, following the UNCLOS rules, with some changes to the UNCLOS rules, yeah? And this map is showing how is at the practical level, how the UNCLOS can work. And was the compromise. Denmark get more territory, we get the gas fields which one we wanted and we already were exploring, and we get the opportunity to put our gas line from Norway to Poland, which will give us, finally free us from the dependency from the energy sources from the dark place in the east. So there is hope, and if the sides negotiate in the goodwill, and the goodwill is the most important part, then the most difficult disputes can be negotiated and resolved peacefully. Yeah, it's not like that only South China Sea is the flashing points. Yeah, in the Baltic Sea there are also some gas pipelines explode, some ships, cables are broke. So there's also a lot of tension there. But still, we were able peacefully negotiate very difficult agreement, and I think it's a hope. So after being gloomy, I wanted to finish my short presentation on this hope note, that if we all follow the international rule, the rules which we all did agree, then we can resolve everything. Thank you. I don't want to take over time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bogus, for saving 1 extra minute for us. And my question is, you recommend a case settled by arbitral, by the judicial means. What would be the challenges for the countries in the South China Sea as Asian countries in terms of using judicial means as one of the dispute settlement disputes? Dr. Moon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen and friends. Just allow me to congratulate and to sort of thank the diplomatic of Vietnam on again convening a very successful and much needed discussion on the South China Sea on the regional security in general, and also our gratitude to the partners who not just support DAV but support us to have a conversation as well. And so I'd like to echo my warmest congratulations in welcoming Timor-Leste to the ASEAN family. Last but not least, perhaps to reiterate what the chairperson has mentioned, I do not speak on behalf of Singapore, which I'm currently working, or Malaysia, which I'm a citizen of. Allow me to share some views in my personal capacity, nor do I represent the ASEAN view as well. I'm just an ASEAN citizen, and I welcome my colleagues from Southeast Asia to give their personal perspectives as well. Allow me to perhaps join the conversation in sharing and addressing 5 short points. First, I think as I mentioned as well, the notion of, or the concept of extra-regional powers, meddling or involvement in South China Sea. To me, if we were to be pedantic about it, what is a region? Southeast Asia consists of 11 nations. So by that definition, all the other regional, so-called regional powers are extra-regional. Does that include China? Does it include EU? If you want to go down that route in that sense, right? So maybe perhaps what I'm trying to pinpoint is that the use of the term extra-regional powers to exclude who is in, who is out, is not useful. Because as our colleague has mentioned that even as friends from as far as Poland or EU or Canada on the other side of the world, they do have interests, and they're not taking sides. If the side they're taking on, and I agree, is a side of international law, of UNCLOS, of affirming the rule of law internationally of UNCLOS. And also, I think diplomatically, a number, if not all the many countries that have been finger-pointed are actually partners of ASEAN. So, for our friends from far and near to perhaps have port visits in around the region, have military exercises with us, that is part and parcel of our ASEAN engagement with our dialogue partners, our sectoral partners, our development partners. So that is also something that's very positive. And it bears reminding that the ASEAN DNA is open and inclusive. So if we were to exclude, to choose our extra-regional friends, then ASEAN might find itself very few friends to work with, and our friends from afar might not have a bridge to work with ASEAN. So I would ask us to perhaps use the term extra-regional powers lightly in that sense. My second point is that perhaps maybe on the notion of South China Sea, are we not focusing too much on US and China? And I would certainly disagree with the notion that we should look at South China Sea from the prism of US and China. There's a danger in that, because the underlying disputes or claims, whatever you want to term it, is not between US and China, right? It's between China and some of the claimant states in Southeast Asia. And I think for the claimants, I think it would be a bit misnomer and perhaps inappropriate to park our issues under the US-China strategy competition. Of course, everything that we breathe and live, we live under the shadow of US-China. But to singularly pitch at that, I think we miss the larger picture, we miss the granular and the important commonalities, differences, and who do we talk to? If we're going to resolve the South China Sea disputes or the overlapping claims, we cannot just talk to Washington and Beijing. A careful conversation needs to be held between Beijing and Kuala Lumpur, Beijing and Hanoi. So the agency of these claimant states, of the ASEAN member states, cannot be taken out of the equation, right? And also to look at from the prism of US-China relationship, it brings us to a different scenario, different outcome, and so on. Secondly, related again to the so-called extra-regional powers, it's not just the US-China that's involved, right? We have mentioned that France, EU, France, and so on are also involved. And from an ASEAN perspective, it's actually good to have more friends. That's also very an ASEAN perspective because it broadens our strategic autonomy. And sometimes when our friends, within the British Navy or the Canadian Navy or the German Navy or the French or the Italian Navy comes through the region for FONOPS, they do conduct military exercises. And these are important for us in terms of capacity building. So they are just do not only look at the possible negative connotations, but these visits bring a lot of benefits to ASEAN member states. Yeah. My third point is that there's also reported increase of number and scope and intensity of military exercises. This is one of the scoping questions by organizers. Empirically, that is correct. And personally, I think, again, it's a positive. ASEAN member states has always and consistently highlighted the point that ASEAN is not directed towards any party, internally or externally. We don't target ourselves, nor do we target outsiders. So when we do have military exercises, be it naval, land or air, cyber or any capacity building, those are actually first and foremost to enhance our respective militaries. Yeah? We learn a lot, our external powers bring a lot to us in in terms of the training, the capacity building. Yeah, it's also part and parcel of our dialogue partner relations with a lot of these partners. And mind you that it's not just China and the US, we have France, we have UK, we have India. I would say the more the merrier in that sense, right? It gives our dialogue partners, our external partners, a way to work with us and for us to work with them as well. My fourth point is that we tend to lose the focus that ASEAN member states, especially the claimant states, so-called claimant states, do have legitimate interests to have to engage all these partners. Yeah? And why do we seek out these partners? Again, I mentioned capacity building, the training, and so on. But deep-seated reflection is also there's a sense of insecurity. When we know that we're dealing with a party on the other side who is 10 times, 100 times stronger than us, this is where perhaps there's a supply and demand issue. We need to enhance the resilience, capacity, and I wouldn't even want to use the word deterrent. I think none of the militaries in Southeast Asia can effectively deter any of the major powers, be it India, be it Japan, be it the US, be it China. So the word deterrence, to me, I think strategically is a misnomer in that sense. It's about enhancing our resilience, and resilience is not just in the context of major power rivalry and so on, but it's also about maritime domain awareness, to enhance our capacity to combat transnational crime, seaborne, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and others. Let me end on perhaps on a last point. Throughout the discussion this morning that the word red line has been used of a major power. But have we considered the red lines from ASEAN member states? Specifically, have we considered the notion of strategic empathy? Have the major powers considered us on the other side of the equation? Well, we are all smaller, weaker, economically, militarily, politically. What is the equation, what is the calculation from our side of the bargain in that sense? So when we talk to our friends in China, we are always at a lower leverage in a sense. We don't have that much leverage. Yeah? And we can see that the current trade negotiation between the US, that asymmetry of power is very clear. So in terms of South China Sea, whenever we take any actions, our actions and whatever we do, we are always dealing with the notion under the context of strategy of asymmetry of power. So maybe for our friends in China, I would perhaps seek your consideration of empathizing with the position that we are in, and also to recognize the legitimate interests of the claimant states. It is not that we are having military exercises or working or enhancing our defense partnership with extra regional powers that we are taking sides. That is not the case. It is actually that we want to build our resilience, to make ourselves stronger, and more importantly, to defend our legitimate interests and affirm international law in the region. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moon, for your insightful remarks. My question is, you mentioned about claimant states and then ASEAN members. So what is the difference between, to what extent can the claimant state do, and what is the stance for ASEAN as the association? Basically, you've heard to all of our panelists, and it's very interesting, but we also noticed that there is a little bit of differences in the approach of each of the panelists. So I was asked by the organizers to facilitate the discussion among the panelists yourselves. But I will start with the first round of the questions from the audience. I will take around 4 to 5 questions, so that hopefully each panelist will have 1 question, and each participant will have only 1 minute at most for the question. So please keep it brief and direct. And then in answering the question, question. You can make comments to the speeches of other panelists and ask questions to other panelists as well. Is that okay? Thank you. So the floor is open for the questions, please. Yes, the madam sitting downstairs. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Hian from the Diplomatic Academy Vietnam, and I want to address my question to Dr. Chow Minh Hao. So I have two questions. The first one is, what do you think is the action or the policy of China in the South China Sea that is eroding trust from ASEAN countries? And secondly, what do you think is one of the most important misunderstanding of international community when it comes to China policy in the South China Sea? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the two questions. I have the lady, yes, gentleman.
Good afternoon. My name is Kang. I'm currently a senior at the International Law Faculty of Diplomatic Academy Vietnam. My question goes to Dr. Moon. My question is, what is the potential of ASEAN countries harmonizing their responses to power increasing interest in the South China Sea? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. As the lady sitting next to you.
Right, thank you. I am Mai from DAV Captain. I have two questions. The first will be directed to Dr. Chow Minh Hao, and the second question will be directed to Ms. Levin. For Dr. Chow Minh Hao, you presented about the Trump 2.0. So my question would be, the Trump 2.0 amidst the US-China rivalry is marked as a rather unpredictable, and this has, no less for several times, made countries a little bit relatively unprepared before Trump's announcement. So, in your capacity as an expert in China, how would you assess that the situation will affect, of the situation of the Trump 2.0 will affect the China or the South China Sea? That's the first question. The second question would be, for Mrs. Levin, you analyzed the direct military-to-military communication channels. It is vital, as you said. It is most needed, but during crisis, you also pointed out several barriers and several limitations during crisis when it is most needed. So I'm wondering regarding other channels that allow indirect communication, which means not direct, like military-to-military communication, but indirect communication, such as consultations or with the help of experts associated with the outside, with the outstate. Would it be helpful? And if yes, then to what extent? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ratha from the Cambodian Center for Regional Studies. I have one question to Dr. Chai. So, what is the ultimate goal for China? What does China want from ASEAN member states, especially in the South China Sea? And what China want the US to behave in the South China Sea to have this healthy cooperation in the sea? And to Dr. Tang Si-moon, as we all know that there has been going on of a COC negotiation. So what do we expect from the Philippine chair this year? And my one last question to Dr. Yana from Russia. As we all know that these days there's probably unilateralism, this and that, a lot regarding this and that. And Russia and China recently, you have some sort of unlimited friendship with one another. So do you foresee any cooperation between Russia and China in the South China Sea? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is for the first round. And each panelist, could you please keep the answer for each question from 1 to 2 minutes?
Okay. It's no easy task for Chinese scholars to attend this meeting. And I thank so much for this very engaging, very important questions. I want to give a combined answer to those questions. So first thing I would like to say, can we think about how to create a synergy between US-China tactical deterrence and the mitigation of the South China Sea tension. Trump talks about multipolar world. Secretary Marco Rubio talked about US-China relations entering a new phase of so-called strategic stability. So we are going to see more exchanges between these two powers. Can we make this increasing momentum between US-China exchanges be positive for the de-escalation and the resolution of the South China Sea issue? Secondly, we need to be attentive to the fact that both China and US, both China and claimant states, they have a very different interpretation on what is status quo, what is revisionism. Can we escape from this dichotomy? And also, I heard the view from a Filipino friend this morning. China wants entire South China Sea. No way. China has no such intention, nor capabilities to rear such goal. Such irresponsible statement is not helpful for effective diplomacy between China and the Philippines. Regarding the misunderstanding, I think one example is the so-called Xi Jinping's statement on no militarization of South China Sea. That statement was proposed by Xi during his visit to the US in 2015. And Xi's words in Chinese actually is, China has no intention, or China does not intend to militarize allies. However, China very concerned with the possible conflicts between US and China in future. Stephen Bannon, very close political advisor to Donald Trump, made it very clear. He is confident that in future decade, there must be a war between the US and China. So we have to think about the worst case scenario. But that, I understand, that hard kind of trust of Asian countries on China. Last thing, so can we find a pathway for kind of restraint framework among relevant parties? Can we use the strategic pragmatism rather than cliche on China blame everybody? Find strategic pragmatism, and international law cannot solve problem. We have to be not naive about this. If international can solve problem, the tragedy between Russia and Ukraine would never happen. Geopolitics really matters. Last point, how to manage the domestic nationalist sentiments in China, in many countries. That could be a very bad thing for policy makers. And in China, some hardliners even claim that, well, if the Philippines, they want a war fighting during the, South China Sea, okay, it deserves it. There are some hardliner voice in China. Actually, China government has exerted some restraint in making response to the Philippines. So I hope our Filipino friends can give a nuanced and, updated assessment of Chinese intention on South China Sea. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do sympathize with you when you mentioned about it's hard for Chinese scholar to be here, but we need you. So please keep coming and sharing with us, like discussing, debating, whatever. Next, please.
Sure, so just to elaborate on this counterpart challenge, I think it's most pronounced at the ministerial level, in part because the role of defense minister in China's system, and you can correct me if this is wrong, but seems to be taking on a less operational responsibility over time. The current defense minister does not even have a state counselor title, let alone a seat on the Central Military Commission, whereas if the US president is asking for military options in a crisis, the Secretary of Defense is the first person that he'll turn to. But then if this is not going to be maybe the most fruitful channel, in part because of those issues, we can think about, I would say, going up, down, or out. So you can always think about a leader-to-leader conversation, and it is certainly a good thing that President Xi and President Trump have established a channel of communication, but at the same time, in an operational crisis, you don't really want to have to start the conversation at that highest level, and of course we've seen President Trump has a very strong preference for addressing exclusively or primarily economic issues in that channel, rather than strategic considerations such as issues related to the South China Sea. You can go down, and I think one of the most important military-to-military channels in the US-China relationship is what we call MMCA. So it's the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement Working Group. And it will not get you anywhere in a crisis, but it is a platform through which operators, so people in the PLA, people in the US military who actually drive boats and fly planes, can get together and share how each side would look at a particular moment of tension or crisis at a tactical level on the water or in the air. And so in the absence of anything like trust between the two sides, I think resolving technical misunderstandings among operators could go a long way towards mitigating the risk of an unintended crisis. It's a really important channel, but once a crisis arrives, it doesn't get you anywhere. The third option is to look at establishing a strategic channel outside of either side's military institutions. And so I think this is a channel that was very effective during the prior administration, and it was the one between Foreign Minister and CFAC Director Wang Yi and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. And that became a channel in which both sides, I think, were clearly empowered by their respective presidents to engage on the most sensitive and important issues in the bilateral relationship. Not that that can replace credible military-to-military communication, but in moments of tension, having those existing relationships at the highest and empowered level can go a long way towards avoiding inadvertent escalation as well.
Thank you. Professor Leonardis.
Dear colleagues, I think you were kind of surprised when I started my presentation and I started to speak not about Russia and Russian position on the South China Sea, but the explanation is very easy because, we are not a part, we are not a body to these disputes, and we don't want to be involved in this issue. And actually, our position was consistent and unchanged for many years and many decades. And let me remind you this position. This is an official position of Russian Federation. I'm not representing here Russian Federation. No, I'm just a Russian expert. But what about Russian official position? First one, we are not a party to this issue. We are not a claimant state. We are not taking sides. The issue should be resolved diplomatically by negotiations, and negotiations should be held by parties involved, not by third parties. And the final one, we see the involvement of non-regional actors as very counterproductive. So this is the official explanation. If you go to the Russian Foreign Ministry, you will see these kind of, basic principles of, our position on the South China Sea. But speaking as an expert, what we see on practice. On practice, we see that Russia is not making statements. We are not issuing statements. We are not making any side. We are not making China, which is our very close partner, strategic partner. But I want to remind that we have equally, not like really equally, but very close relations with all of the countries who are parties to this dispute. We have the strategic, really close partnership with China. We have very long history of our relations with Vietnam side. And right now, the current Russian policy is, to promote these kind of relations, to promote relations. We have this pivot to Asia concept right now. So we are pivoting to Asia. We want to be here bigger, but bigger not militarily. We want to be here bigger economically, humanitarially, people-to-people contact, various positive projects, not like military projects. When you speak about South China Sea, Russia is not taking sides because we have good relations, like I mentioned, with China, with Vietnam, with Malaysia, for example. We hope we will have better relations with Philippines. And, at the whole, we see ASEAN countries as very good and very prospective partners for Russia. So we are here very positive. And I want to highlight one interesting thing. When you want to help, countries who are vulnerable to great powers, you have to help not militarily. Because when you try to help militarily, you just provoke, all these military build-ups here in the region. You have to help economically. You just provide economic aid, you provide economic, opportunities, investments here in the region. You help those countries to be confident by themselves. You make these countries, to be less vulnerable to economic leverages, let's say from China, for example. So that's important. And let me highlight this very interesting thing. Like, that there is this big issue of oil and gas exploration in the disputed areas in the South China Sea. And what is interesting? The interesting thing that, Western companies left those disputed areas a long time ago, like in 2005, 2008 maybe. Like American and UK oil and gas companies, they just left those projects. They had with Philippines, with Vietnam, they just left. Why? Because they were kind of uneasy, confronting China and Chinese pressure. But what about Russia? We didn't left. We were the last to have those, joint projects with Vietnamese side. So that's very illustrative, example, of Russia's participation here. What else? And maybe the second question was also addressed to me. It's kind of, connected to this one. Can we expect more cooperation between Russia and China here in the South China Sea? Yes, we can, but not in the South China Sea issue. I'm pretty sure we are not going to back China on the issue. We are not going to take sides. It's not our policy, it's not in our interest. We want to be here, to come back here, but very positively, as a very positive partner. We don't want to provoke any side here. And, probably you can mention, like last year we had these joint sea naval exercises in the South China Sea, Russia-China drills here. It was last year, but you should understand, you should put it into perspective. Like since 2005, Russia and China started to have, for the first time, naval exercises here. Not here, just naval exercises together. And started from 2012. We made it like regular exercises between our navies. And we have different scenarios in different areas. We had even scenario which took somewhere in the Indian Ocean together, like it was Russia, it was China, it was Iran, for example. We did it several times. So one of the scenarios was here in the South China Sea last year, and I think we had this kind of scenario in South China Sea in 2016. But it's not so much, and it's not like we are coming here to show other sides that we are back in China. It's not. It's just, we have this kind of military-to-military cooperation, and that's one of the scenario of this cooperation.
Thank you, Yana. May I just make one clarification? I'm wondering why you mentioned about direct negotiation with the participation of the party involved. You just, missed out other peaceful means for dispute resolution, including mediation, conciliation, and the use of judicial means, which are provided in Article 33 of the UN Charter. Is that intentionally, or you just like...
No, just when I'm speaking involved, I mean mostly militarily involved. I mean this one, not mediation, not this.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bogas, please.
Your question was about was the biggest obstacle for the Clemens countries to settle down peacefully. Well, mistrust. Simply like that. If the countries don't trust each other, how they can negotiate? And Dr. Zhao said that China doesn't claim whole South China Sea. Technically, you say true, because 9-dash line cover only 80% of the South China Sea. So it's, yeah, technically you're right, you don't want to 100%. But in these situations like that, how you could negotiate? How? Someone is coming and 80% of everything is mine, and that's it. And so I don't see the other logic perspective could be the other claimant countries. Negotiate each other, settle down mutual disputes, and prepare one united front against the guys who want to take 80% of everything. So I see the light in the tunnel, all thanks to the Beijing, because the Beijing strategy is, in my opinion, counterproductive, pushing the other countries, coastal countries, to cooperate closer. And I hope, we are not there yet, they will be able to settle down each other's claims, and then to prepare the joint united front against China. Because it's the logic of the situation, yeah? But of course, we know very well this in international relations, the reality of the international relations, logic and common sense not always works, unfortunately. But let's hope for this.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Burgess. Dr. Moon, please.
Thank you. On ASEAN and South China Sea, ASEAN as a collective, as a regional organization, does not take sides, does not have a position on the South China Sea. But it does have an underlining interest in maintaining peace and stability, and to, if possible, prevent any escalation of conflict because of the sea lanes of communication, of regional stability, regional security, and so on. So it bears reminding that the ongoing COC negotiations is not to resolve the overlapping claims, but could be rightly seen perhaps as a crisis management mechanism to make sure that the South China Sea disputes does not boil over into open warfare. Yeah. On the question of our colleague on the harmonizing positions of the great powers in the South China Sea, if I hear your question correctly, again, the position of ASEAN is very clear in the sense that we work with everybody, but when you go down to a different level among individual ASEAN member states, we do see differences in the relations with all the other major powers in that sense. So there are two levels that we need to look at in ASEAN as a collective. This is where sometimes analysts feel a bit frustrated when it comes to ASEAN joint communiques and ASEAN summit declarations. It doesn't say anything, it's very diplomatic, we're working well with everybody. And that's a reality, that's the goal, that's what ASEAN is actually about. But when you peel down the layers, ASEAN member states, you find that certain ASEAN member states work closely on the diplomatic front with certain countries, certain major powers, on security with others, and with on the economic side. I would strongly recommend you to refer to a major study completed by Professor Kong Yun Fong and Joseph Souffliao, who looks at the question of individual Southeast Asian states vis-a-vis the question of US and China. And the finding is very interesting that in the last 10 years or so, the general finding is that most of us, except Philippines, are leaning towards China. We are not pro-China, but measured from soft power, economic power, and engagement, including votes in the UN and so on, we are leaning towards China in that sense. Another survey by my institute, ISIS, acknowledges that China is the most influential economic, political, strategic power in the region. But yet, most of us in the region are also distrustful or fearful of how China uses its power. So it's not a dilemma, but it's a fact that China is powerful, but if that power is being used on us, directed on us, we have grounds to be concerned. And the question is, how do we moderate, how do we ease power China into becoming a major power? Question of the COC again, on Philippines. I think we shouldn't put too much pressure on on Philippines as chair of ASEAN in 2026. In fact, Malaysia has not lodged a bullet because the responsibility for the COC is still with Malaysia as a co-chair of ASEAN-China relations, and by default also co-chairs the COC, the negotiation process. So Malaysia will work with China to guide the COC process. So Malaysia is in charge, at least procedurally. I'm also would like to point out that President Marcos Jr. in receiving the gavel of the ceremonial handover of the ASEAN chairmanship from Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, he mentioned a very interesting quote, perhaps in reference to South China Sea, perhaps in reference to China as well, that cooperation and conflict cannot coexist at the same time. I'm paraphrasing him. Perhaps in the context of South China Sea, that we can, if we continue to cooperate with major powers, including China, but at the same time allow the same bilateral relationship to fester in conflict. Water and oil does not mix in that sense. So what's happening in the South China Sea, if it's still tension filled, but at the same time we turn around and say we are partners, we're looking at that it's difficult to square the political question in that sense. So cooperation has to be on both sides, on the military, political, economic side, and all levels. So for the President of Philippines to mention that, perhaps is a good reminder that we should de-escalate and also look towards to the ASEAN chairmanship next year.
Thank you very much. I think that I do have time for one more round. Yes, Professor Tung, please.
Madam Chair, I guess my question is for Dr. Levy. Since you are coming far from Washington, D.C., I would like to hear about your opinion on the new Trump's administration on the national security strategy. What would be your expectation about that specific strategy in terms of substance and style, especially when in the region the common sense is that the South China Sea issue is somehow should be placed in the greater context of U.S. and China relations.
Thank you, Professor Tung. For the question, yes, Ambassador Hong, please.
My question to Dr. Zhao and Mr. David. In the context of major power competition in the region, what is the most realistic outcome with regard to the peaceful settlement of dispute in the South China Sea in terms of near to medium term? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hong. Yes, I have a lot of, can I have one gentleman here and then one lady there, and then to this side.
I have one question to Dr. Zhao. First of all, I would like to thank you. As you said, you're using restraint in, preventing the Filipino fishermen to fish in our own exclusive economic zone, and you're using restraint. Thanks to the water cannon that you're using, not bullets whatsoever, and thanks to the Chinese Coast Guard vessels that you're sending to harass a very small 44-meter Philippine Coast Guard vessel. I would also like to comment about your statement that it is not true that you want to claim, for the People's Republic of China, to claim the entire South China Sea. If that would be true, and that would be the statement, or that would be the position of the Chinese government, I would like to challenge you now to say in front of the audience here that you are dropping the 10-dash line claim of the People's Republic of China. And if so, I would also like to ask, if China doesn't really want to claim the entire South China Sea, how come you have reclaimed 7 maritime features that are originally unoccupied way back in 2012 and was completed in 2016? You have been mentioning this and relating it with Trump administration, but I have to remind you, the completion of those 7 maritime features was completed in 2016 a year before Donald Trump came to
Can
office.
you keep your question brief? Otherwise, we will not have time for answers. Okay, thank you. The other one down there.
Good afternoon. I'm from Faculty of International Study, Nanyang University. I have one question for Dr. Levin. Thank you for your sharing. It's very instructive. So my question is, to what extent do bilateral agreements and defense treaty with external powers such as the US, Australia, or Japan determine or conversely strengthen the overall unity and bargaining the power of ASEAN as a bloc? Thank you.
Thank you. May I ask the gentleman here and then the lady after this?
Yes, I'm from the EU delegation in Hanoi. So I'm very interested in this particular topic because we have seen as something that has been very encouraging over the last couple of years, which is more cooperation between ASEAN claimant countries. But we're slightly confused as to what is happening in particular with the EEZ delimitation agreement between Vietnam and Indonesia, because we have not seen the ratification, even though it happened a couple of years ago. And would some of the panelists maybe care to comment on this, because we found it terribly encouraging, but we don't understand why it's taking so long to ratify. Even maybe the chair could comment on it.
So the question is addressed to whom?
Well, to the chair and also maybe Mr. Moon talking about ASEAN, but also some of the other panelists, because I think it was mentioned also by Mikhail.
Yes, yes. The lady, please. Yeah.
Thank you. So my name is Hao. I'm one of the DAV captain.
I think that I asked the one as the lady. Yes.
Hi, my name is Alisa. I'm one of the young leaders of the Young Leaders Program. And I want to direct my question also at Dr. Zhao Minghao, because you mentioned climate change at the end of your talk, which I thought was very interesting. And climate change really is one of the few issues, I'd say, where all claimant states have shared interests when it comes to adaptation and also mitigation. So what are some of the possibilities when it comes to cooperation on climate change in the South China Sea, but also some of the challenges?
Thank you. And then anyone from that side? Yes. Gentleman in the front, and then a gentleman down. Yes, you first. You first. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I'm one of the young leaders this year. I wanted to ask all the panelists, you've started talking about this in part, but more directly. In the absence of trust and political will, where do you see the capacity for technical or operational cooperation between regional stakeholders? And not just great powers, not just claimants, bilateral, multilateral. I want to push you to sort of talk about not just the issues at hand, but where we could go with this in the future. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Megan. I'm one of the young leaders this year. My question is direct to Dr. Chao regarding the notions of the revival of G2. There was one proposed and then, let's say, not interested by both Beijing and the Washington. So, if it were really to happen in the meantime, is there changes in, let's say, China global aspiration or any rhetoric behind the revival of this G2? So, thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have two questions, online questions. So can you one address to Ms. Levin and the other one to Dr. Yana? So can you read down the question for the audience, Ms. Levin? That is a little bit provocative one.
So on the online question regarding how the U.S. downplaying UNCLOS and adopting a tougher stance toward China will either soften or embolden China in the South China Sea. I think that maybe...
Okay, and then the other one for Yana. Can you just read out the questions? No, but the audience has to know what
You want me to answer right now?
I want you just to read out the question for you.
Okay. You want me to read it?
Loudly,
Okay,
yes.
I'm sorry. So the question to me, what is the potential of non-regional players to shape multilateral diplomacy in the South China Sea?
Thank you. So those are the questions for this round. May I invite anyone who would like to start first? You have so many questions. You need a little bit more time so that Levin may go first. Professor Minghao. Okay.
I think the Academy should consider to pay me double honorarium. So, quick response to this excellent question. The first thing is about China's claims over the South China Sea. Well, we don't have time to elaborate on it. But I would say, do you know the story of 11 dash line drawn by Republic of China in 1947? Do you know that's history? Wow, 9 dash line problem has a really complex historical background. We have participants from Taiwan. You know, before 1949, the Communist Party established the new Red China. Actually, it was Chiang Kai-shek regime, Republic of China, draw 11 dash line. So do you think the Communist Party of China would concede from that stance? So it's very, very complex. Secondly, our Russian partner even would not be supportive of China's claim over the South China Sea. You see the obvious disagreements between me and Yana, so there's no such access of upheaval among China, Russia, DPRK, Venezuela. Second thing is about Philippines. Can our Filipino friends learn some lesson from the policy practice of your previous government? I mean, Duterte administration. During Duterte's time, actually, both sides managed the disputes very well. So I would say, in terms of the island reclamation or other construction over features, many Calimate states, they are doing this. It's not so fair to just point a finger on China. The third thing is about, the climate change. Well, I would say, according to some U.S. defense intelligence assessment, in coming decade, the problems associated with climate change would be the major source of the security, the traditional security conflicts in this region. So we can say the nexus between the climate change and the traditional maritime security concerns in this region. We need to use a strategic forecast perspective to identify the potential and possible challenges that may complicate the situation. G2, well, China does not like this term. But I do say there is an opportunity for both Washington and Beijing to enhance purposeful and meaningful exchanges. But I do say the Xi-Trump summit in Busan, ROK, is not an end to tensions. It's not a strategic reset for U.S.-China relations. It's just a tactical detour. But the question is that how should we take advantage of that tactical detour to do something meaningful to mitigate U.S.-China tensions? I think that can be helpful in terms of mitigating the tensions over the South China Sea issue.
Thank you very much. Ms. Levy, please.
Great. Well, there's so much to engage on. To start with the question, to what degree should the U.S. think about supporting ASEAN in its bilateral agreements or other arrangements? It's a really important question because it's so important for everything the U.S. Does on the South China Sea to support regional cohesion, regional cooperation, and wherever possible, the respective resolution of disputes among the Southeast Asian countries. And so, for example, where you see certain, let's say, mini-lateral groupings engaging on maritime security, Quad, for example, with Australia, India, Japan, and the US, real efforts have been made to ensure anything to do with maritime security is fully complementary to ASEAN's own efforts, respectful of ASEAN centrality, and consistent with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And that complementarity will be absolutely necessary to achieving anything like success in US objectives and supporting the region and achieving theirs. In terms of an online question, I think that, look, the most important thing the US can do in deterring China's most ambitious instincts in the South China Sea, whether that's taking 80% or 90 or 100. I think the most important thing the US can do is strengthen its alliances and partnerships in the region, ensure that it is the United States is being as useful as possible to the maritime countries of Southeast Asia as they work hopefully together to uphold their own sovereign rights in the South China Sea. And also, it is important that the US communicate clearly with China on this issue, but whether it's about the significance of UNCLOS or other elements of US policy, I think that communication with China, public or private, is largely about avoiding downside risk. It's avoiding the risk of inadvertent escalation, whereas the most substantive engagement, the most important engagement the US can have on this issue is with its Southeast Asian partners. I have to bite on this axis of upheaval comment as well, because we've been encouraged to interact. I think that it's really interesting in the South China Sea context because, this is, as my colleague mentioned, such a challenging issue for Russia in that it has very close partnerships with Vietnam, with China, with other relevant countries. And so as we see Russia become increasingly dependent on China economically, financially, for support for the war in Ukraine, we've seen Russia start to make compromises to China, for example, expanding Chinese access in the Arctic, expanding Chinese access in Central Asia. We have not seen that yet in the South China Sea, but will be as Russia continues to become kind of more dependent on Chinese support. I think that's an interesting thing to watch. And I have to also just briefly address this G2 question as well. I think it is honestly one of the most unfortunate messages to come out of the summit in Korea, because I take the point that China doesn't use the term G2, but we can go back to the very beginning of President Xi's first term, where he was looking to establish what was called a new type of great power relations, and the U.S. rejected that term because our sense then, and arguably still now, or at least until very recently, was that U.S. allies come first when we're looking at Indo-Pacific policy. And so I think that this G2 idea, just to go back to where the conversation started, Dr. Zhao mentioned that many regional players are relieved to see U.S.-China tensions mitigated for now. But in my experience, countries in Southeast Asia especially, they always are mad at the US and China for one of two things. It is either that tensions are too high and there's a risk of inadvertent escalation, or is that tensions are too low and partners are worried that the US will sell out their interests in some kind of G2 arrangement with China. And so it is always the obligation of the United States, if we want to maintain good partnerships in this critical part of the world, to be reassuring our friends that neither of those things are happening, and we understand our responsibility to avoid them while maintaining a responsible relationship with China. And so I don't think that this G2 comment sums up in practice the totality of the U.S. approach to the region, and you can see that even in Secretary Hegseth's comments here in Vietnam, and his very strong support for our allies and partners. But the message is still problematic and will be something the U.S. needs to work to address going forward.
Thank you, Levin. There's one more question online. Can you just briefly address it? Is the U.S. missing out on its potential influence in the region by specifically focusing on security?
It's a good question. I think there is a view in the current administration. I think that the military cooperation, maritime cooperation, can be separated out from the United States' economic engagement or even people-to-people engagement with the Indo-Pacific. I worry that that may not be a viable approach over the longer term, in part because, as we all know, this is a part of the world where the economic is the strategic. But also, it is so important that the US work to build trust with its friends in this part of the world, and ultimately that cannot be achieved solely in the military domain, and so it is very important that the United States find opportunities to be credible and useful partners in the economic space as well.
Thank you. Levin, there is one question for Liana, so online, so I will read it out and then you will address all of them together. The question to you is, extra-regional players' involvement in the South China Sea is counterproductive. Would you say Russia's engagement here in oil block exploration and mineral exercises and military exercises is similar? And is it also taking side?
Yeah, so probably I will start with the first question on the screen. The question is, what is the potential of non-regional players to shape multilateral diplomacy in the South China Sea? It's a hard question because I just don't understand what does it mean multilateral diplomacy in this specific area. If you mean creating multilateral structures like AUKUS, like what? No, I don't think that has very positive, implications, for the South China Sea, situation. If you mean, speaking about multilateral diplomacy, you mean creating new, let's say, negotiating mechanism, like today during first section of first panel, we heard about this new mechanism that China created, like, what is it, International Organization of Mediation. I don't think that's also the solution, to the question. We have this UNCLOS, and we have mechanisms under UNCLOS. Why don't we use it? Why should we create something new, right? Because, yeah, we have it. If you mean, speaking about multilateral diplomacy, do you mean that non-regional actors should put more pressure on sides, involved in the territorial disputes? No, I don't think. I don't think they should put pressure either on, Asian countries which are involved or on China. It's also very counterproductive. I mean, if you need to get the solution, to this problem, let these countries, to see themselves, and, talk to each other. Just talk to each other. Because, like, my personal position, when non-regional players get involved in those kind of conflicts, it goes like really bad. I mean, that's what we see, for example, in the crisis in Europe or something like this. And I also have, I want to add several comments to what I heard from my colleague from the United States. She mentioned it for several times that Russia is kind of dependent on China. It's not. I mean, it's really a strange perspective. We very often hear this kind of stuff. But, like, Russia has a very long history of being a great power, and we know how to manage our relations with great powers. We know how to manage, how to, to construct, how to develop our relations with China. And it's very respectful relations. I mean, we respect each other, and it's not like we are putting pressure on each other. And I would be really grateful to hear from my American colleague if she can tell even one case when Russia went against its national interest in favor of China. I would be really happy to hear it. We always do everything in our national interest, but our national interest very often, very, very close, I mean, very near to the Chinese national interest. So that's why sometimes we act, as a bloc or something like that. And speaking about, like, I mentioned that non-regional countries, many of them are kind of counterproductive in the South China Sea. When I say that, I mean mostly, military, kind of stuff. I mean, it's very good, when those countries are coming here, bring economic prosperity, bring maybe there, some solutions, for the South China Sea issue, which is very complicated. But you know, I really against this military stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. The two gentlemen, Professor Dr. Bogus and Dr. Moon, if you have any comments.
Okay, there's one question to all the panelists about the trust. How we can build the trust. Well, I think we are incredibly lucky. No military personnel died yet. The last victims were Vietnamese Navy personnel in '86 when the Chinese shoot them. But we are incredibly lucky that now, these days, no one died from military personnel because this could trigger the real service response. So far, unfortunately, we are just lucky because there is no restraint, there is no rules of engagement. So maybe the first step could be to create the rules of engagement. Personally, I don't believe it's going to happen. And small comment to Dr. Zhao, who said before that China built a military presence on the futures in the South China Sea in anticipation of the future possible military conflict with the US. In the room is plenty of the military personnel. Everybody will tell you that this military installations are completely useless in the case of the conflict between big powers. Unmobile, on the small land, in the fixed position, they will cease to exist in the first hours of any conflict. They are used only for the projection of power in the peacetime. And there is a reason why they were built there, to project power in the peacetime, not for the hypothetical war with the US. And before I say the European Union is a part of the equation here. It is and it will be here, not only because of the interest, security, economical, but also by the citizens. 2 million French citizens living in the region of the Indo-Pacific. They are also EU citizens. And I know there are some countries in which citizens are disposable commodity, but not for us. We will take care as the community, following the solidarity. We'll take care for our citizens, EU citizens in this region, and will fight for their interest here and a better life. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Moon, please.
Just very briefly, there's a saying in the region, when elephants fight, the grass pets trample. When elephants make love, the grass pets trample as well. And the analogy is that ASEAN is the grass. Yeah? And to follow on Dr. Levin's point, I think the soft spot is that we don't want relations between US and China to get too hot, too conflictual, nor to be too cold, be frozen, it doesn't happen. Yeah? So there should be certain balance, and this is where I think ASEAN comes in. Regardless whether it's too hot or too cold, ASEAN remains open for US and for China to work with each other within the EAS format, ARF, ADMM plus format, and also with us in that sense. So keeping ASEAN quote-unquote neutral, open, and not forcing us to take sides, but practically US does want us to take sides. China does want us to take sides, and the side they want us to take is their side in that sense. It's counterproductive, I think both parties would actually know. So for us, not taking sides doesn't mean that we should not take positions. Because the positions, international law, UNCLOS, these are positions that we should defend, and I see our friend Dr. Zhao also nodding his head. So we should not equate not taking sides as inaction. We should be, our action should be founded on principles and positions. So the challenge is to find out what those positions that one binds us together. I think the common denominator is rule of law, free trade, and context of South China Sea UNCLOS. Thank you, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you, Mike. I'm terribly sorry that we went over time for 20 minutes. And just the last question to the chair. The very good news that the two countries concluded the final draft of the treaty on the limitation of the EEZ. We are now working on our domestic procedures to ratify it, and normally those kind of treaties need 1 to up to 4 years to be ratified. So it's not out of our expectation that it takes time. hopefully we'll get that result soon. So basically, thank you so much for all the panelists. Could you all join me for a big applause for our panelists? And to my colleagues sitting next to me, to Dr. Michelle, please make sure that you be here and your colleague will be here next time. Yeah, no pressure. Yes, thank you.